Roguelikes are big right now. Ever since their humble beginnings as ASCII dungeon crawlers, they've exploded in popularity, especially in the indie scene. You've got Derek Yu's Spelunky, Crypt of the Necrodancer, Rogue Legacy, Darkest Dungeon, Faster Than Light, Risk of Rain, and more. These games are so called because they draw influence from an ASCII dungeon crawler from 1980 called Rogue, hence Roguelike. They're like Rogue. Each of the games I just listed play very differently, but there's something unmistakably rogue about them, namely in the fact that they play lip service to the game that arguably popularised them. Rogue is difficult to play nowadays. Put simply, it's obtuse, hard to control, and not very much fun. But what's important is what it brought to the game design table. The thing is, for years the gaming community has had a hard time agreeing upon what exactly that is. This has led to some big debates as to what a roguelike actually is, and which games are worthy of being part of Rogue's legacy. See what I did there? Back in 2008, developers of roguelike games got together in Berlin to decide upon the aptly named Berlin interpretation of what a roguelike is, and it became the de facto definition within the community. They defined traits like grid-based, contains dungeons, that it has permadeath, and is hack and slashy. Those are just a few, here's the whole list. The thing is with lists like this, is that the more rules and criteria you add, the more restrictive it becomes, and the less creative developers can be when experimenting with similar concepts for fear of being labelled not a real roguelike. By the Berlin interpretation, a game has to have most if not all of the high value traits, and at least a few of the low value ones, in order to be considered a roguelike. Those who don't make the cut are called rogue inspired, or roguelite if you want to be extra confusing. Remember the games I mentioned earlier? By the Berlin interpretation, none of them are roguelikes. That's crazy, right? They might not fit the criteria, but the influence is obvious. To imply these games are lesser and exclude them from the roguelike genre because they don't copy Rogue enough is pretty backwards if you ask me. Now, I'm not arguing that we don't need genres, of course we do. They're great shorthand for communicating quite broad ideas about different kinds of media in a very efficient way. Let's take a look at different kinds of film genres for an example. On the structural end, we've got romance, comedy, action, drama. These kinds of genres tell us the way we can expect to think about the movie. We're going to laugh at comedy movies, get hyped up for action movies, and get confused by human courtship rituals in romance movies. Then we've got more thematic genres. This is stuff like sci-fi, western, and fantasy. These genres tell us about the general aesthetic of the movie, and possibly what kinds of ideas it's going to be dealing with. Sci-fi movies often like exploring the insignificance and powerlessness of humanity, for example. That's not to say that genres actually exist within these kinds of categories. Stuff like the detective fiction genre deals as much with the structure and premise of the text as it does with the characters, arcs, and setting. By mixing and matching genres in a modular sense, we can communicate complex ideas about what a movie is in a very short space of time. Star Wars is a sci-fi fantasy action movie, Blazing Saddles is a western meta-comedy, and so forth. Obviously there are more genres and subgenres than this, and more are appearing every day. Genre works similarly for video games. We've still got the thematic genres like film, and our structural genres are, once again, themed around the ways we think about different games. Platformers are all about traversing obstacles, puzzle games focus on you solving explicit or more organic puzzles, and shooters have you, well, shooting. Video games also have another axis of description owing to the uniquely interactive nature, and that's the method we interact with them. This is stuff like first person, turn-based, text-based, etc. By slapping these genres together, we can describe almost any game. Zork is a text-based fantasy RPG, Hitman is a systemic third-person puzzler, and Mario Kart is a multiplayer fantasy racer. Modular genres let us describe the ideas of games quickly and effectively in a way that anyone can grasp. For example, when I say turn-based strategy shooter, you'll probably think of something along the lines of SteamWorld's Heist, a game which is exactly that. The use of genre in discourse lets us paint with a broad brush about a whole canon of media, but issues start to arise when we see genres as entire descriptions in of themselves. Roguelike under the Berlin interpretation, as well as other similar descriptions for other genres, referred to very specific kinds of games whose design can't be strayed from. And whilst a lot of people, such as Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit and Chris Franklin of Aaron Signal, have looked at this issue from a design perspective, I'd argue the root of the problem is epistemological in nature. The well-intentioned human desire to have concrete answers to vague questions like, what is a roguelike, is often warped by the allure of answering an easier, cosmetically similar question. The Berlin interpretation didn't define what makes roguelikes roguelikes, they defined what makes rogue rogue, a far easier and far less meaningful answer to come across. Roguelike hasn't meant what the Berlin interpretation guy says it means for ages, if it ever meant that. It seems to me that the genre roguelike usually refers to the kind of thing Spelunky does. If you've somehow not heard of Spelunky, it's a tricky game that sees you controlling this cute explorer guy as you delve into a series of randomly generated platforming challenges that task you with descending a big cave and reaching the end door to progress. Spelunky's main takeaway from Rogue isn't just difficulty or having the game take place in a randomised dungeon, it's the broader design ethos of mastering a rule set that make Rogue so compelling in the first place. In Spelunky, you don't advance by learning how to tackle specific problems or by getting to grips with a complex set of moves. No, advancement in Spelunky comes from learning the underlying rules that govern the game and improvising around them to progress. See, everything in Spelunky has consistent rules. Spiders always drop straight down on you, there's always a damsel, who's not always a pug, in each level, bombs have an explosion radius of 2 tiles, this gravestone formation always hides the entrance to an optional level, and Anubis and his scepter always spawn on floor 4-1. Once you learn you can activate these rock traps to kill enemies and clear terrain, they become much less threatening. It's the same with every obstacle that Spelunky presents. Spelunky can theoretically be beaten very quickly by an absolute novice. The controls are simple and the game really isn't very long. The thing is, if you've not obtained an intimate knowledge of Spelunky and its rules through trial and error, then you won't stand a chance, and no amount of wiki checking is going to help you. We've got the same thing going on in Crypt of the Necrodancer. Item descriptions are vague, enemies require trial and error to learn how to defeat, and a single misstep is likely to get you killed. Like many roguelike games, Crypt of the Necrodancer isn't about executing on readily available knowledge, the challenge is about learning, internalising and then mastering Necrodancer's bevy of rules and mechanical interactions. My favourite example of this is the Dragon Dance, a sequence of movements many intermediate players pick up on that lets them trivialise these scary dragon guys which normally spell an instant game over unless you've got awesome gear. Roguelike as a genre, instead of referring to a game that's like Rogue or has any of the Berlin interpretation's traits, or in fact any defined set of traits at all, is actually communicating that a game engages with this idea of systemic mastery over many repeated attempts. Now, this all might sound counterintuitive, but think about it for a sec. It's the case throughout gaming genres. The genre RPG doesn't actually mean role-playing game in the majority of modern-day RPGs. You don't actually play a role in the traditional sense, just a set of statistics and abilities on legs. In Final Fantasy XIV, for example, yes, you're a character, but you're not exactly a part of the world, nor are you expected to roleplay. You're just a player avatar. It's the same for something like Fallout 4. Yes, there's a story, yes, you can make choices in it, but there's often no permanence to your decisions, and there's no real impetus for you to think about the game as if your avatar really existed inside of it. In fact, in many cases, it actively goes against Bethesda's design goals of having a large sandbox in which the player can do anything and everything. So, why call them RPGs at all? That's because over time the genre RPG has come to mean has stats and or XP. Language is constantly changing, and a lot of the time it doesn't actually make much sense when you look at it up close. But so long as people understand the meaning of what we're saying, then what's the problem? So, you might be thinking now, okay, but why does this matter? Why would I make a whole video to tell you that genres mean different things than their literal interpretation, when I could be making a video about, oh I don't know, the failures of the Sonic franchise? Well, it's because we in gaming tend to think about genre in an unhealthy way, and it hurts the things we produce. In the previous video, which you can watch here, we saw a bunch of games sticking to Civilization's template out of little more than habit, and until games like Spelunky came along, roguelikes were the same. Stagnant and not very popular except within a die-hard fanbase. By broadening and decentralising the definition of roguelike, the genre has found new life, and a bunch of new games have come about because developers have been free to see roguelike not as an indivisible blueprint, but a single modular genre of many. Spelunky and Rogue Legacy are both different takes on a roguelike platformer, and FTL is a strategy roguelike that takes big inspiration from the sci-fi genre for a lot of its design choices. Thinking about genre in a more broad sense doesn't mean we can't be inspired by past games either. Look at Dream Quest. Nope, seriously, I know it's ugly, but keep looking, trust me. Dream Quest is a game that's remarkably true to Rogue's original design intent. Hell, the only high value factor of the Berlin interpretation it doesn't fulfill is the non-modality bit. It takes Rogue's design but adds in the deck builder genre to an existing format to create a whole new fascinating game, filled with way too much cool stuff to talk about here. By combining existing genres and influences together, we can also create new genres that can in turn be used in other games. Let me show you a recent example in the form of Gigantic. The MOBA, which means multiplayer online battle arena, another weird literal definition of a genre, came about because its pioneers, mostly Ice Rock and the Dota team, put together the genres of real-time strategy and action RPGs to make a whole new genre. Around the same time, developers were mixing first-person shooters with class-based MMOs to make the first class-based shooters like Team Fortress. Gigantic is a class-based MOBA, and manages to do something new with existing concepts by combining them in interesting ways. Taking things that already exist and remixing them is a crucial part of making not just new games, but new pieces of media in general. Restricting that by unfairly canonizing certain games or with arbitrary genre definitions that force developers to stick to a formula stifles this process and makes games worse for everyone. Developers need to understand that a landmark, successful game is nearly always a reimagining of an existing formula, or a wholly new game which borrows just a single genre from what's popular. Rehashing the same games with the same combination of genres isn't going to be that fun to play, as it's already been done, and it's not going to make money for the same reason. Gamers and critics too need to stop arguing about what genres mean, and instead argue about how best to use existing genres to create cool experiences, better games, and even brand new genres. Genre is a complex subject with no easy answer, but it's important that we think about and debate the overarching critical landscape of games as they mature, so that interactive media can be nurtured into being a legitimate art form to stand amongst the rest.